What a wonderful 2 days, and another opportunity to try to bring things together here. And as I was thinking about one of the major themes that seemed to be running through all of the presentations today was the idea of connectivity. So from science, how two brains can operate as a single unit, to the communal aspects of rites of passage, to loving your neighbor as yourself. And so here's my question really to any of you or to all of you. How does awakening change when you move from a solitary experience to something that happens when you're part of a group?
You say that again. This was a bit distracting.
The nature of awakening. So we can think about awakening as something that happens, just something that you do yourself, or something that you do as part of a group. Is that a different experience depending on what's involved in awakening?
I've just been talking so much. I've just been talking so much anyway. Do you really want me to start?
Yes, please.
All right. Everything is a gift. So it's never anything that you can produce. But you can prepare yourself for it. So you can prepare yourself for a moment of awakening. And then it is not an individual thing, never a private thing, because it is your awakening to your connectedness with all others, for one thing, and it is made possible only by the cooperation of all others, otherwise you wouldn't even be here. So in both respects, it's a gift and it's a communal affair, I would say.
And I would like to add to that for me, an awakening is a discovery. It's when you see something new that you haven't seen before. It's when you understand something you didn't understand before. And although that awakening has a personal side, it also has a community side. Discoveries are shared, and they become part of our culture, part of our community, part of our language, part of our lives. And so they're both together and shared.
I want to follow up on this, though, and particularly because we have two people on our panel here who are part of religious practices. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but my image of what a Benedictine monk does is you spend a lot of time by yourself, or a Zen priest. That would seem to be a very solitary experience, isn't it? And presumably part of the task there is to experiencing awakening as you're doing that. Vanja?
I think the being solitary is a very important part. It's the stop that we cannot. That's necessary. We cannot do it otherwise. We have to stop. We have to retreat somehow to discover the connectedness with all. So you retreat in order to realize that you're connected with everything. You're always in one spot somewhere in a location, but you can be connected with everything. There's this little story where a robber stops the Buddha and says, "Stop," and he just keeps walking, and he gets annoyed and he jumps in. I said, "Stop." So the Buddha looks into his face and he says, "My friend, I have stopped. You have to stop." Since he said it without anger or fear, I guess the guy was very impressed and became his disciple.
Adele, let me follow up with you. I mean, the stories that you were talking about were typically involved in rituals, in ceremonies. What happens there when you're part of that, within that group setting?
Well, I think in terms of awakening, when you get to awaken in the company of others, there's this element of just sheer pleasure and joy. And when you awaken in the company of others and you recognize that you are awake, they are awake, you are awake, they know you're awake, everybody is seeing that we are now awake. It allows you in your ordinary life to be more awake in the company of others. And that we become, it's like a sangha, we become reflections for one another that help each other stay awake and can raise the bar in our ordinary levels of consciousness. And I think that's what community and sangha do.
Does awakening always have an ethical dimension? Does awakening always have an ethical dimension?
Ethical dimension.
Does anyone want to tackle that?
Would you say more?
Well, I mean, the question is, I mean, what you often hear, for instance, in spiritual practice is, and certainly the Buddhist, the Dalai Lama, for instance, puts this at the forefront of what he does, is he always says there's an element of compassion in what he does. In other words, when you have a contemplative practice, it is not just about going deep within yourself. There's an element of doing good in the world. And I guess I'm interested in how those two things go together.
Well, the bottom line of every ethics, whatever ethical system it is, the bottom line is always to behave as one behaves when one belongs together. Formerly that was smaller groups, or the animals at least were excluded. Nowadays, in my lifetime that has happened, the line around those to whom we belong can no longer be drawn. It's the whole universe. Formerly that was still somehow a different mentality, a different consciousness. And therefore, if you awake to belonging, which is your awakeness, it is a profoundly ethical step. But you have to put into practice. That's why I say waking up is not enough. You have to act awake.
In Vanja, I was struck by, in your talk, about how so much of what you talked about, the things that were going to make us uncomfortable, there was always an ethical dimension in everything that you were talking about. And I'm wondering how much of that came out of your spiritual practice, that orientation.
Well, I think when we are really awake, when we're really present, we don't need any rules, basically. That's when we make the rules for the times when we are not really awake. Sort of guidelines that we know we get forgetful, and then we remember that in our best moments we know we don't want to hurt anybody. So we may forget in a moment of anger or something, then we remember. So that's where we sort of, in those moments, we create ethics or rules and guidelines, I think.
So, Joy, if we bring this within the context of what a scientist does, how does awakening resonate with you, that whole idea?
Well, this has certainly caused me to think about this. I have to say, this is not a topic or a context with which I've thought about this, but the presentations yesterday and today have sort of shed a new light for me on some of these ideas. And some of that new light actually forms itself in questions. And I actually have a question for our religious leaders here. Does the idea that we can actually find a physical connection now between two human beings, does that in any way enhance or change the way you think about self?
Excellent question.
Thank
For
you.
me,
You can take over my job here.
For me, it was exciting and wonderful that one can also see it from the outside. You see, this is the difference. Science, by definition, looks at the outside. Spirituality looks on the inside. Science speaks in the third person, spirituality can only speak in the first person. And we should not get the two mixed up. Like the little boy who has a real scientific mind, and must be admired for that, and he has a milk tooth, and whenever sugar gets on his cavity, it hurts. So finally the milk tooth comes out, he puts it on a little plate, puts a piece of sugar on it, and wants to see how it hurts. that brings home the story very well. You know? But I was looking from the inside, from the first person, I was delighted to see that one can also see it from the outside. I will tell all my friends.
All right. That's a good answer. Right. Yes.
Well, it seems like it's not the only truth that has been discovered by the spiritual traditions for a long time, like the relativity of time and space and so forth, that then science has now come up to prove in a scientific way. And our culture is, science is the new religion, so to speak. If it's not scientifically shown or proven, nobody will listen or believe it. So this is very important.
Actually, that's a very sad thing, I think, because what I have done today is sort of show you the obvious. I mean, it's something that our religious heritage, whatever it is, thousands of years of heritage, you already knew this. I didn't teach you anything new today. The language that I put it in might allow me to be a little bit more convincing in this culture that we have. My language is going to be more effective in getting it funded at the NIH. But I don't think I have added any truth yet. Maybe someday. But today I didn't add anything that wasn't already known and elaborated on and understood better. That the science that I've shown and the state of science is very immature relative to the deep understanding and wisdom of our ancient clerics.
And you're so unlike most scientists in saying that.
I actually want to follow up on that point. I mean, that's a fascinating point, which does raise the question of, so what is it that you're doing as a scientist? If to some degree you are confirming what you're saying we already know.
Woo, he got me, didn't he?
What can you do? By doing this kind of a study, I mean, I think it's almost a larger philosophical question. You know, what is it by showing the science of this? What is that add?
This is a really, really good question. And I think that science does add a lot. And what it adds is mechanism. There's wisdom in the world, and there's mechanism. And when we understand mechanism, we know how it works and why it works, and we, being the masters of Yankee ingenuity, can use it. And once we understand how our knowledge can be used and under our control, we can create better drugs, we can create better therapies, and we can manage the quality of our lives at a higher level. So I think it's our ability to predict from what we understand is what science contributes. It doesn't contribute wisdom, but it contributes the ability to use what we know more effectively. Is that?
Well, I would add that it looks like you are a living example for it, and Albert Einstein was also a living example for it, that science seems to be able to create wisdom, actually.
Well, with the help of our friends.
Well, speaking of mechanism, Adele, I have to ask you about this story that you told, the mushroom experience in the, I don't know if it was in the tent, with the blindfold on, you pulled the blindfold off, you saw the old woman had turned into a hummingbird. Later you discovered that the hummingbird was her totem. What's going on there?
I got it right. I didn't see a mountain lion or a deer. I saw what apparently is her medicine animal in that culture, and she turns into that at different times during the night. And like I said, sometimes the doors of perception are cleansed and you get to see clearly.
And speak to what that means.
Well, I think, I had no intention of seeing that. It really was brought about, through the mushrooms and through, being present to that experience. And I don't know, maybe it's something in my DNA that even allowed me to see that. I don't know. I don't know what it was in me that my interest, my involvement in that world. Maybe I was connected in some way, or she allowed me to see that. That could be it too. That she did, somehow knew, and I was gifted with that vision of her.
Or maybe it was another example of coherence.
Can I actually? We'll come back to you in a moment because it's hard for everyone to hear. Do you have any sense of? Do you have a theory of how that might happen? And Vanja, you might want to join us as well, seeing as this is partly what you are interested in studying right now, is the connection between contemplative practice and psychedelic experience. The fact that there seems to be something communal happening here. It's not just within one person's head.
Well, you have to also.
Okay.
In the case of our study, I think we made use of the mechanics of the session, like of a format. It's like a container that, and then we filled it with a different. Usually, we just sit and we have this format, and then the psychedelics that come in seem to. It seems like a certain structure at least can be helpful. Albert Hoffmann, who at the very end of his life had the good fortune a few weeks before his death, I spent a whole day with him, and he was standing there and he was looking into very strongly and said, "These sacred substances belong into the hands of meditation," he said. For some reason I was sort of, for him, he was already 102, I represented for him, I guess, Buddhist meditation or something. And he was very strong. He said that, and he looked very strong in my eyes. And so I think we have two very powerful disciplines, or that we can combine, or that we seem to go along, at least in my understanding, very well, or very. They do support each other in a very good way, I think.
I'd like to add too, how did that happen, or these other questions that came out. I think there's always an element of grace in these situations, and sometimes that grace just happens, and it's bestowed on you, or it's bestowed on the situation, and you just, relax. You're soaking in it for that moment, and it's magic. Yeah.
We've been talking about the element of compassion as part of awakening. We've been talking about trying to make the world a better place, and it brings up very real world problems that we face out here. For instance, around America, we've been dealing with the often tragic consequences of the racial divide in this country. Look to Ferguson, to Baltimore, to here in Madison. And I'm wondering if if developing this whole idea of an awareness of conscious evolution, if that has something to say on those kinds of problems that are out there that we're all struggling with. Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
I think what Brother David said this morning about fear, that all of that starts with fear and it leads to violence. And so how do we reduce the fear? How do we raise consciousness amongst the people or amongst the authorities or police force? But it's that element of fear.
I think that one way to look at this is sort of between the glass half full and the glass half empty. And one way to think about it is an opportunity to improving our social or cultural conditions to prevent these things from happening. And you say, okay, why didn't she say something smart? Because we all know that. But I think that as we begin to understand ourselves better as interconnected with the community and learn to use that understanding in a more effective way, we might be smarter at creating conditions where these types of tragedies could be avoided. And so I think there is no answer to your question, but I do think that there's reason to hope.
Brother David?
Well, I think behind your question is really a bigger question. How do we deal with what is life-denying? I don't want to call it evil or bad, but at least we are confronted with life-denying things. How do we deal with them? And there are two ways one can combat it. One can see the good and the bad ones, and the good ones have the duty to fight the bad, and that leads to the good then also becoming bad. Or one can have another attitude and to look at whatever is bad or life-denying as the not yet good. And that means looking at it with a mother's eyes, because there were many occasions when we were not all as good as we were supposed to be, and just the way our mothers looked at us said, you can do it, you'll outgrow it somehow. And that created the space into which we can become good. And if we look at the world, at the worst things in the world, with a mother's eyes, I think that will be better than trying to fight it.
Adele, as I was listening to your talk, I was fascinated by your accounts of these various rituals and rites of passage in these various settings that you were describing at Burning Man, in some of these Native American communities. And it made me wonder if, clearly the suggestion is the larger culture could also benefit for more ritual, for more rites of passage. And I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts of how that might be possible. Meaningful rituals. Because I think many of us feel that, the churches were supposed to offer those rituals, and often they seem empty now. But not always, but sometimes.
Well, I'd like to say that I don't think I used the word ritual at all.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. It's only that I like to distinguish in terms of self-generated ceremony or ceremony that where people really understand what it is they're doing and why, as opposed to ritualized form or content where there's the understanding has been lost, and so it becomes kind of rote, or it then can become institutionalized in ways that might not be so beneficial. So I've personally stayed away from the word ritual and like the word ceremony, because I feel like in ceremony, if it's co-created, or even if you're in a particular kind of religious organization, if you understand what you're doing it's more meaningful and more powerful. And I think it can start in the home, and it can start with family and finding ways to communicate that just have a sacred structure to it, a little bit of ceremony, so that you're not just having a meeting in your household, but you're doing something special. I've know families who make talking sticks, or they have special objects that, okay, this is different. We're not just having a talk around the dinner table. We're actually sitting down and we're in a special space right now. You can light the incense, you can smudge, There are very simple ways to elevate ordinary experiences so that they become more meaningful and have more depth and more consciousness to them. Yeah.
Brother David.
That seems very important to me. To stay awake, we need ceremonies, and especially in families with children. For instance, you have to create them nowadays. You have to find what the blessing, for instance, means. But it is a different thing whether a mother sends the children to school with a blessing, whatever that is in the context, or whether it's just say bye, mom, and out the door. Mm-hmm. And many are also to live gratefully, which for me is to be awake. You can create many, many little rituals. Many people have before meals or after meals holding hands, saying what they're grateful for, or last thing in the evening, what am I grateful for in this day? But inventing little ceremonies, as you call them, is very important, and also for people alone to invent for ourselves little ceremonies. That means little stop signs. That's really all it is. Little stop signs so that we will really look at reality.
And I think probably most people here have an altar in their home. And they may not even call it an altar, but it's a place where you might have family photographs, shells from the beach, a stone that you picked up, and you just put it there. And it's like this unconscious impulse to want to, maybe it's a place you go then and meditate, actually meditate. Maybe it is an actual altar, but you gather together your special little things, and it's on your dresser or it's on a little table in the hallway. I think it's a natural part of our impulse as human beings, and how to make it more conscious.
Since we don't have these rituals anymore as a culture, we have to recreate them, which has, it's too bad that we don't have them anymore, but it's also a big opportunity that we actually are free to create them. And we have to recreate them anyway, because after a little while we get used to it again, and then they don't really work anymore. So if we, as a stop sign, we can use like church bells, or then after a while we maybe have to switch to telephones ringing, that we take it as a stop sign, or so we have to keep moving with it and be creative and find new ways, new ceremonies.
Do any of you have specific suggestions for families, parents with children, to help usher children into the world as they get older?
My good old friend and fellow Zen teacher Norman Fisher published a book, Taking Our Places, and they had twins, and when they became into the puberty, they went through with their children and with their friends of their children, they developed a whole, which is very nice to read, a set of things that incorporated all kinds of things, vision quest and so forth. Mm-hmm. And that would be a perfect time to introduce psychedelics.
Go, Vanja. In the book that I wrote, in A Sense of the Sacred, I go through a lot of passages, and I give accounts of things that people have done and things that I've witnessed or things that I've been part of. And there's a chapter in there called Teenagers, Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. And gives a number of examples of how to create like these meaningful rites of passage, especially with teenagers, where they actually do gain new status. It's one thing to have a confirmation, or there are different things. We do have these in different religious structures, but it's like getting a driver's license is a big rite of passage, but there's not much sacred around. It's just how to get away from the parents and away from home, but if you can find a way to create something. Most of the kids I know have gone through a vision quest.
How old are these kids?
Anywhere from like 12 to 16, and alone, fasting, with guides, other children, and then when they return, giving them more privileges and more responsibilities. Where their status is changed. They can come in later. They've graduated, and it has to have some reality to it. It has to really feel like they need to feel like they have increased their status and their abilities into adulthood. And not just the good things, but the responsibilities too. The fun things for them, later hours or, whatever it might be.
Well, I will attest, as the father of a 17-year-old, my 17-year-old's recurring complaint is, none of this stuff is real. That
Yes.
Being in school and all the the hoops that you jump through in school, and it's sort of somehow, it would seem, trying to make things more real and more. So in some ways, he would take on more responsibility if he felt there was more at stake.
Mm-hmm. And he would be given more freedom too, at the same time, with the responsibilities. So, yeah.
Let's throw this open to, I'm willing to bet we have questions, comments. Let's go back there. In the middle right there, yeah.
I have a science background as well, and I was thinking to add to Joy's response, when you think of what science has revealed about evolution and the Big Bang, I think the stories that science has given us about the creation are much more phenomenal and fantastical than a lot of the creation stories of various cultures. And when you think of Barbara's presentation the other day, and I think this Joy is just starting on this, she just gave us the elements just to prove something, and now she's going on to how you tie these things together. That's where it gets really interesting. And it's just revealing that how complex the universe is, and that it generates things. Science has shown and proven this to us. So that reality, I think, is just awesome. And the other part is how we can use these things. I heard Bessel van der Kolk talk about dealing with trauma. And there's some experiment where they monitor the different types of brain waves, and they put it into a computer game, and the boy learned how to accentuate one of the brain waves and deal with some incredible out-of-control anger in his life. Now there's science again as a mechanism.
Joy, do you want to follow up on that? I mean, the role that science can play in helping us to give us new narratives.
Well, actually, thank you for that, because I think you answered the question perhaps better than I did. It's an example of where understanding the mechanism allows us to use the tool to the greater good. And actually, you raised the issue of neurofeedback. That is, understanding how the brain operates and using that understanding to help people control their own neural mechanisms. It's a very important and fast-moving area of science, and I think it's a very nice example of what we were saying. By the way, I like the turtle story, though, of the beginning of the Earth.
I'm curious if any of our religious representatives, spiritual representatives on our panel would care to comment on the role of science in helping to think about the story, the larger story that we're living.
Yes, for instance, Thomas Berry has contributed so much to the spirituality of people who read his books by showing how much more, as you said, how much more wonderful the story of evolution is that science gives us than what we had dreamed of as creation stories. It's beautiful. It doesn't contradict one another, but it's more closer to reality, I would say, to the outer reality. The myth had always captured the inner reality, but the outer reality is so much more wonderful than we ever thought.
I would just like to add to what you're saying and bring in the issue of the fundamentalist sort of oppositions to science and how deleterious that is to all of us. When a new discovery or a new idea is considered to be an evil invention or discovery, and oftentimes, or can be, that the science is actually shut down. And as the science is shut down, so is the narrative. So is the narrative. As scientists, we need people with wisdom to interpret our findings many times. Oftentimes, that the voice of wisdom is really the voice that interprets what science does and adds meaning and texture to it. And as people's attitudes against science sort of shut it down or put a wet blanket on it, it's a kind of stop that deters progress. I know it's a little editorial, but that's sort of my point of view.
Let's go over here on the aisle there.
Thank you. I've been listening for the last 2 days about senses and humanness and also technology and science, and trying to synthesize a number of the themes that have emerged. And one of the things that strikes me is in the advent of the internet and social media and just technology with cell phones and things that were talked about yesterday, and bringing the world together so that a tweet could circle the world in 20 minutes. And yet, on the other hand, we're talking about the importance of the senses and of the human connections, and you were talking about how pistons and minds that operate, and if we communicate in an online environment, for example, how do we preserve the humanness of our interactions when in a lot of ways we're coming together, but we're also removing some of the dimensions of our normal ways of communication?
There was an article in the New York Times recently called The Faceless Epidemic, and it addressed this issue of how our communications and particularly ethics in communication change when we're communicating with another person where there's not a face involved. And one of the ideas is that when there was not a face involved, people became much more rude, they became much more unedited, that there were communications that wouldn't be acceptable if indeed you were face to face. But again, I think that the issue is, the glass half full or the glass half empty, that this is an opportunity, the global, worldwide connection is an opportunity for us to evolve a global consciousness, use it in a different way. Actually, I raised this issue of the global epidemic, of the faceless epidemic with a bunch of students recently at a seminar we were having. And they said, oh, it's just you old guys that don't know how to use it. They said, we got it all figured out. Well, we ignore the bad stuff and we sort of edit the good stuff and we know how to manage it. And I thought, you know what? They probably do. And that this is probably evolution in progress. They are managing it. And that it really will be an important advantage to us.
One can probably say that the technology of the internet is one of the greatest things that happened. But it is only like a skeleton. We have to make it alive. And only when it comes alive will it become that noosphere that Thea Deschedin and Barbara talked about. That's up to us. We have all the structure. Now we have to make it come alive.
Let's go over here. Sorry, I don't mean to keep running you back and forth here. Yeah, over here.
I'd like to ask Vanja and Brother David and Adele this particular question. You've all spoken of experiences under psychedelics. And my question is, how do you know in any of those cases whether the experience you have is revelatory or distorting?
Revelatory or story?
Yeah. Revelatory or distorting?
I think we are talking here about something that is parallel to science, where you need peer review.
I would like to say too, I think it's actually Ram Dass who said this, that if on a psychedelic I have the experience that I'm God, that that's revelatory if I also see you as God. If I see me as God and nobody else as God, that's distorted.
And I think it's important to keep that question in mind. I mean, we again and again have to ask ourselves this question and not be too sure.
I mean, is that? I mean, it's fascinating to think about that, because you might just think, oh, you're having this mind-blowing experience. By definition, some larger dimension of reality is opening up to you. But you're suggesting maybe you need to ask some questions as well.
The good thing is that we really ought to take the inner experiences as seriously as we take the outer ones. But we also have to, we know that we have optical illusions on the outside, so we can also have optical illusions on the inside. And we have to correct it. But taking it seriously is wonderful.
Let's go right in the middle here. Wait, hang on for the mic.
Similar to Vanja Palmer's, I've had many psychedelic experience in a variety of things, from mushrooms to peyote to LSD. LSD, like window pane, Grateful Dead stuff, was the highest I've ever gotten until recently when I did ayahuasca. And the ayahuasca ceremony was in a dark room, and we were really cared for. A lot of music was being played, and I merged. It was a merger. God and I were not separate. There was just a one, and it was so brilliant and colorful, and so see all those, like in the beginning of each session, there was psychedelic kind of mandalas going around and stuff and coming out. It was like that, a lot like that, only it was physical. It grabbed me. I didn't grab it. It grabbed me and had its way with me. I had no control and didn't want any. I just let go. So that to me was absolutely an aware experience of God or of whatever it is. You can't even name it. Can you speak to that?
Probably better to be silent about it, but I may say that much, that it is never just the substance, the drug. It is obviously also you, and obviously you were ready at that point. I mean, conditions and came together that allowed that to happen, and so it's probably everything you did in your life before prepared you for that moment also. Yeah.
Let's go up here.
There's so much polarization in the world, but let's just look at our country. Philosophically, as Joy mentioned, between the fundamentalists and the people that are more perhaps closer to being awake. The racial, which is really bad right now, polarization, okay. I think we have a fantastic opportunity. There are several hundred people in this room. If you could instruct us to go away with a mandate that several hundred people here operating in a fairly awake state are more powerful in deflating this polarization than the millions that are doing it by default. So what can you send us away with our homework, so to speak, to pay you back for what you've given us?
I can put it very briefly. Fear not. Fear not. That's all. Everything else will flow from that.
Support science.
Here, let's go over there.
I just wanted to bring a different aspect about the future of combining like computers and the transhuman movement. There's been a recent headline about, I think it was in Russia or something, they were going to remove a guy's complete head and put it on another body. And it's inevitable that we're going to be, some of us at least, will be merging with computers into our body and other sort of machines into our body. And I would like to know what you guys think about how that would affect consciousness, if we're saying consciousness goes through the heart too, and they're feeling the heart in the brain, if that will somehow split consciousness or affect it, or maybe make it more of a global in a much easier fashion. I just was wondering how you guys would respond to that.
Who wants to take that?
That's above my pay grade.
We can at least try to inch our way towards it. And I would say that it's important to distinguish consciousness from thinking. And what computers can do is thinking, and they do it a lot better than we do. But consciousness is an emerging phenomenon by which we, who are within time and space, neurons, atoms, molecules, touch something that goes beyond time and space, and are invited to take it just as seriously as they take one another. And that, so far, we have no evidence that computers have ever done it, and not much hope that they will ever do it. But we don't know. We stay open for surprise.
So I would add to that, do not be afraid. That the technology that you're talking, is my microphone? That the technology that you're talking about is a technology that's rapidly being developed, the man-machine, man-woman, human-machine interface. And it's being developed in the spirit of developing prosthetics for people who have lost limbs or have injuries. It's a very, very important development. It is actually oftentimes engineered based on brain signals of the neurofeedback type that was mentioned earlier. So one can actually use signals from their brain that would be normally used to control a hand or a foot, but yet now they control a device. Yes, there's people who imagine applications far beyond that, but that's imagination. At the moment, this is very, very important type of research. And so I think in the hands of good scientists, don't be afraid.
Let's go to Barbara up front here. Wait, hang on just a moment. We need the mic.
Joy, I'm reading a quote of what you said that might apply to the question of the mandate that we could have. you said biological infrastructure and an automatic reciprocal mechanism for connection exists among brains. Biological infrastructure and an antenna and an automatic reciprocal mechanism for connections. This biological code could be the basis for an emerging global and collective consciousness. And since I have spent a lot of time, you might say, pre-experiencing such a collective global consciousness, I'm wondering if, what mechanisms we could use, since I think there's a lot of shared consciousness in this entire group, that might affect our brainwave patterns.
Sometimes as scientists we say things we don't understand very well. It could be that Barbara understands better what I said than what I said. But my basic idea is that this predisposition, this ability, this infrastructure for human brains to connect is automatic. You can't deny it. If I'm looking at you and I'm talking to you, that machine will start. And so I think that what I mean is that this is an automatic process that is embedded with us in our brains. It comes with us with the package. And if we just let it happen, it will.
May I?
Let's go over there.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Just say, I'm sure you didn't mean only automatic, because it is alive, and what you are measuring is the automatic structure of it. But what makes it what it is, the meeting between two human beings, is a conscious, alive meeting, and that's the opposite from automatic.
Thank you for clarifying that, because this is what I mean. By automatic, I mean alive. It's part of our natural makeup. That's what we do when we're alive. I'll think of a better word. Thank you. Reflexive is a very good word, actually, because it's. I was going to say it's automatic. It's not. It just happens.
Let's go over here.
My question is for Joy. Do you have any plans to use your Optode hat to look at the interaction of two brains on psilocybin? That might be hard to get NIH funded. But
nobody has asked me to do those studies yet. I do think that there are opportunities to look at the effects of drugs, not just psilocybin, but any drug, on interactiveness, drugs that are designed for antidepressants, for enhancing social behaviors of one kind or another. I do think there are opportunities to study those effects with this two-brain paradigm. We certainly study them already with single-brain paradigms, and there is nothing that I see as ethically modified by studying them by two-brain paradigms, except that we might learn more.
Let's go over here.
Sort of follow-up question to the earlier questions. When I listen to the experiences that a lot of you in the audience have had on sacred medicines, they sound very similar to experiences I've had not on sacred medicines. I'm wondering if any of you can compare and contrast the sameness or differences in those experiences.
Can you just to follow up, can you talk about the kinds of experiences you're referring to?
Sure. For example, after doing a bunch of personal work and at a workshop, and I have a practice of a dancing meditation that I do, and I was doing it out in the midst of standing stones in a field in nature. There was an experience that lasted about 5 hours where I would move my hand, and there was just this experience of feeling myself connected to everything in the universe and literally seeing, as I moved my hand, the universe moving with me as I danced, as I moved. And actually it was interesting in that moment I was I was wanting to play a particular song on my iPod, I would actually stick it in my cleavage and dance. And there was a particular song I wanted to play, and the iPod kept skipping, and it kept skipping, and it wouldn't play. So how I actually got to that ecstatic experience was I decided that whatever came on, it would play a song for 15 seconds and then shift to a different song. I decided I was just going to be in the moment of anything that happened in that moment of that song. And so I danced just as each song came on. And at some point, I just burst into laughter. And that's when I just felt everything just explode. So that was an experience of I was seeing it, but not actually seeing it in physical terms, but it was just as real. And I'm actually wondering if the drug doesn't make it more visible into the nervous system somehow, but it's somehow the same experience. Thank you for letting me share that too.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it was something I wanted to address. And I don't know if this would be true for you, but in general, so I'm not really speaking specifically to you, but I don't think that psychedelics are for everyone. I think that if you are already in a very open state, if you are already having paranormal, psychic, visionary experiences, consider yourself lucky, that you don't need something to break into that space. And I think it's also really important with psychedelics and with younger people in particular that you have a fully formed ego before you go about going through a dismemberment process, which is what psychedelics ultimately do in session work. So if your ego is already fragile and shaky, it's probably not the best thing for you to do. Maybe more therapy, other kinds of work before you venture into the realm of psychedelics. So make sure you have an ego already intact before you go about dismembering it down.
Vanja, did you want to follow up on that, sort of comparing these kinds of experiences, whether you're on psychedelics or experiencing them in other ways?
Well, every experience is different. I mean, every experience is different. Not two psychedelic experiences are the same, but as Brother David pointed out, Houston Smith showed that from the outside, from the description, you cannot distinguish them. I mean, the description that the people give afterwards and the effects it has over a long period of time are obviously very similar. But every experience is different. And every person is different. So it's... I can't say one-to-one like that.
Just one quick finishing note.
Yeah, hang on for the mic.
Forgot to add the funny part. Once I had that experience of laughing and realizing everything was connected, the iPod switched to the song that I was trying to dance to originally, and it's never skipped since.
That is a wonderful place to leave it. We are out of time. You've been a fabulous audience, and thank you to our panelists.